I'm going to give you a little gamble through my commercial entrepreneurial life, if you like. And I've got a few artifacts or bits and pieces that I bought up from Somerset today, probably to remind me what to talk about partly, but also to just give a little bit of focus and catch at different moments in my life which might be of interest to you. Just a couple of questions from me to you. Firstly, how many people here run their own business or aspire to? Can you stick your hands up? So I've just got a feeling. So quite a lot. Yeah, maybe 30%. How many of you are exporters? Come on, stick them up if you do. Very few, perhaps under 10. How many are farmers? Any farmers here? One. Brilliant. I'll talk to you all afternoon. Right, so let me get going. So my life started commercially in terms of fashion back in, I hate to say, an awful long time ago, about 1971. But in reality, at school, I was at school in Bath, we used to collect and wear Victorian military uniforms, which were very fashionable, Sergeant Pepper, the Beatles, and I used to collect them, escape up to London occasionally, hitchhike up to London, and sell them on Portobello Road on a lovely Welshman stand. And that uniform represented, if you like, for me, something that was a passion. And I think, in a sense, hopefully what you'll hear repeatedly is, if you haven't got a passion in your business, don't do it, would be my first lesson. So that was my passion. I loved them. They were beautifully made. They looked fantastic. They wore fairly well. And they sold very well. So from that early beginning, that brought me up to London. I got a scholarship to study business studies at Westminster College in London. And having got here, I was sponsored by a company called Charrington Gardner Lockett, wonderful company, but solid fuel in Surbiton. And I just couldn't see it happening. And a great friend of mine worked in the Westerner in London, a shop owned by a man called John Michael, who was one of the Carnaby Street gurus at the time. So I went to him and said, "John, could I possibly be your management trainee?" And he said, "What's that?" And he did give me a job. He let me work, I think for nothing, probably. But I made the coffee, I cleared out the stationery cupboard, and then I got the job of buying belts. And that, if you like, is the beginning of the next stage of the story. So John was almost like, not a father to me, but he was really, really kind to me and looked after me and gave me my first break in fashion. Now, while I was buying belts for him, for his shops in Oxford Street and King's Road, we used to get hippies coming in off the street. So again, just remember that thing of, it is possible to walk in off the street and talk to a retailer. Might seem fairly difficult, but you can do that. And they used to come in with their belts and say, "Hey, ma'am, would you like to buy a belt?" And we'd buy them and we'd sell them and we'd make, even then, 150% markup. And I thought, this is crazy. This is wonderful. I could do that. And my father was then at Clark's Shoes, and he managed all the children's shoe production. And I said, Dad, where can I buy some leather and a knife to cut the leather into belts? And he pointed me at Bermondsey, which in those days was a street that just sold leather, buckles, cutting tools, anything you needed for that industry. So down that street I went and bought my bits, made my first belts, and sold them to boutiques like Bus Stop, Bieber, Miss Selfridge, as was then. It was very trendy. I'm sure it still is now. But that was how it all began. Now, second prop coming up is, hopefully on the screen, which it is my first business card. And that was, you can see, quite a different typeface in those days. It was very cool. It was the typeface you had to have. My sister drew the tree for me. She was a graphic artist. And as you can see, that has nothing to do with Englishness or classic or British. It was about fashionability at that stage. There's the trees on that. So I designed and I made my belts down in Somerset, and my mother became my co-director. They gave me £500 for my 21st birthday present, and that was the beginning of the journey. Friendly bank manager Sydney, I think, gave us an overdraft for £500 to match it. I think that bought the stationery in our first buckles, and off we went. But to just give you a feeling of how different styles were, that was a Bieber belt I did. Must pop these in the right place, otherwise I'll get totally lost. Enamel buckles, which a girlfriend of mine came and wore in a bad taste party some years later. And we actually baked those enamel buckles in the oven. 3 cute little belts. We did about 20 colors of these for Sterling Cooper when they were a boutique in Wigmore Street and were the trendiest boutique. And we did little envelope clutch bags to match. But fundamentally, if I didn't change my style every season, you were out. 70s fashion moves so fast that literally your face didn't fit if your collection wasn't totally different each season. It wasn't like today when you build on things, it was about fast change all the time. As a young designer, I headed out from a very early stage to Paris, and I bought my first buckles there. I used to go to these little foundries and do white meta silver buckles, plastic or rhodoid sunglass material buckles, which we formed especially with another French maker. And I also went to Pret-a-Porter, which in those days was the mecca exhibition in the world for fashion designers and retailers to come into. And I showed, in my second year visiting that exhibition, I had a tiny little stand on an amazing jeweler's stand who was making my buckles for me. And it was interesting that as you tried to reach out to buyers around the world, and what made you interesting and cool, obviously, first and foremost, product, but secondarily, who were you with? Who were you networking with? Why were you there? And this was a cool jewelry maker, and guess who bought from me there? Browns. Browns, who I'd been trying to get into for a couple of years, came and saw me on that stand and then bought from me. So that international movement and being in the right place and putting yourself in front of the buyer that you can never get to see because their diary is full, find a new way to get there. Same time through the 70s, I started designing as I went out to France and Italy. I used to buy all my leather in Italy, visiting the tanners, seeing how they made their goods over there. And I ended up designing for Kenzo, for Ralph Lauren, for lots of the big design companies through Paris and Italy, particularly, and the USA. And of course, I would get to see their collections 9 months before anybody else did, because I was designing the accessories for them. So I got to see their color palettes, I got to see what the looks were going to be across a wide section. And it enabled me, as an accessory designer, to know exactly what the color palette would be from highly fashionable to quite boring all across. So I always got my colors absolutely right. Secondarily, lots of the people that watch those shows, like you might be watching a show now, would see the belts and they would see something about Roger, Saul or Mulberry in them. And so when I came with my collection to sell, they'd go, didn't I see that collection on Enrico Coveri? Yeah, I designed that. So again, that thing of getting in and getting into the market. France and Italy and Germany became my biggest markets by 1980, 1979. We had 80% export. We won the Queen's Award for export, which I'll come back to. But before we got there, the next opportunity or frustration for me was this tiny little jacket, which is called J1, and hopefully there's Roger behind me in J1 full-size version back in 1975, and that was the first jacket I designed, and it was made out of old army shirts, War Department for the use of, and the army was selling them in bundles of 1,000 different sizes, and I used to buy them, cut out the center, there were great big long tails to them, cut out the center, cut off the bottoms, turn them into pockets, put a leather collar on it, and there was J1 with a zip down. It was the first time anybody had really used casual style, blouson, leather and fabric together. That jacket, it was the first time the press, the PR ladies, said, oh, well, he's a great accessory designer. Suddenly I was a designer. So I'd grown up, if you like. Behind that jacket, I then did the hunting, shooting, fishing collection, which is probably the most famous collection in certainly the 70s and 80s that I did as Mulberry. And it almost became hopefully became, yes, how big is that? Pretty tiny. But that was a board that we did a board each year at Mulberry, which put together all of the elements of what happened that year. That year, we went global. We were selling in Japan, in New York, to the best stores, and it was based on me going around chasing my wife, who was a model, doing fashion shows with a magazine at agricultural shows, would you believe, around the country. And I had time to spare as I was waiting for her to finish. And there were these amazing exhibitors with saddlery, with hunting, shooting, fishing. And I just thought this would make horse girths and bridles. I just thought this would make a fantastic collection. And just remember, back through this, I was just heading into handbags. Until this time, belts had been like handbags have been in the last 10 years. They were the it product. Virtually nobody carried handbags. I know it's silly to say. But the belt, whether it was on the waist, high, low, double-belted, whatever, was the article. So that collection, and there's one bag in there which you can barely see. You can see that this holdall here. And I used inspiration like army officers' Sam Browne belts. So lots of military influence has always been there for me. String belts from netting for fishing. And I also did a little brochure, which you probably can't see very well, but we took and superimposed a picture we'd taken in the country, which was of Monty and I walking through the countryside with our collection. We then went and stood in front of a poster in Notting Hill, which had something else on it, and superimposed it. But that idea of going out with a brochure or a piece of collateral to your customer was pretty unheard of then, but it gave us that first thing of a lifestyle and a look, and something you could look at the brand as opposed to just the next or the last fashion collection. By now, we were selling really well in France and Germany and Italy, particularly Europe, as I said, and also America had been quite enormous, our biggest market by far, but quite dangerous, quite fickle. But France would become almost a favorite, and I designed a briefcase called Roger's Briefcase. It was mine, I did design it. But I designed it based on my grandfather's briefcase, who had been not an estate agent, a surveyor in London. I think he had sold Selfridges to Selfridges, so he had done well in his own day and been given that briefcase. So I then designed off it, I put the straps around it. This one looks like it's about 200 years old. And a little story around this. When I left Mulberry in 2003, I started Sharpen Park, and we were showing at a Soil Association trade show, and it got nicked out of the back of the stand, and we thought, that's it, gone forever. So we put up a reward for £500, heard nothing, and then about 3 months later, this sort of rather awkward voice phoned up, "Here, I got your briefcase." So we thought, whoa, what do we do now? Phone the police? And it turned out it was a young 16-year-old whose voice had just broken, and he had found it up a tree in Bristol in the park, slimy and horrible. Squirrels had eaten the bottom of the briefcase. It looked like it had been underwater for 200 years. And a lovely lady in America gave me the materials to restore it. So that's that story. But the other half of that story is that we opened in Japan in probably 75, 76, but really got going in the 90s and were opening shops. And while I was out there, the Japanese customs go, "Oh, Roger's briefcase. Can we have Roger's briefcase?" And so we made some for them, but of course saddle leather, that one is pretty heavy, is very stiff and doesn't mark and looks perfect for years, as mine did before it got underwater. So we made them some, they didn't sell. So I said, "Look, why did we bother? Why did we do that?" And they said, "Oh no, Roger, you don't understand. It doesn't look like yours." So mine had got the patina of age after 20 years. So we then made this one in the factory, and we literally did that antiquing where your thumb would have gone around the handle and just aged it generally wherever you'd have used it, and then we sold loads. But just classic sort of example. Moving on to the end of the 1970s, we did again, trying to think of that collateral and how do you reach out. We did this tiny little magazine, which you can see up behind me, which is literally a mini Vogue. And it was our first ready-to-wear collection. I'd taken on my first ready-to-wear designer, and it was very, very different from that English look, which had way gone 5 years before as we hit 1980. And that we sent out all over the world to our customers, and we actually got British Airways to advertise in it. Would you believe? They wouldn't do it now, but they actually spent £1,000 or something on an advert. First Queen's Award for Export, 1979. I'm afraid that's all I've got now, which is a cardboard effigy of it. But we won that 3 times in my Mulberry career. And that was 80% export around the world. Just to give you an idea of the flavour of exporting through those years, There was no euro, it was French franc, Deutsche Mark, every currency was separate. Currencies went up and down independently all the time. As an exporter, we had to ship internationally, obviously. We had to insure it, we had to deliver it. It took 3 or 4 weeks to get there in those days. You had to try and get a letter of credit to get paid, so paying was difficult. And it cost you probably about 25% of the cost of the goods to ship it. By the end of the 70s, we were free delivering in local currency within 7 days at a cost of 5%. So we had taken away from the customer all those problems that you as fashion people understand. Will I get it? Won't I get it? When's it going to arrive? We tried to remove every barrier to trading. However, Queen's Award of Export is often known as the one thing that you get it one day and then the next day things go wrong. Next day for us was the world recession, 1979-80. We lost our entire American market as our prices effectively went up by 50% because of the strength of the pound against the dollar, and we couldn't sustain it. We'd been a great fashion designer brand, but we weren't sitting at that Gucci Prada level, and therefore we lost the market, as did 95% of all other European designers. So that was devastating. The Americans then decided they were going to go and buy seriously in Hong Kong, China, and that whole phase moved on. My next piece that, if you like, helped me out of that recession, we'd had our factory by then, we probably went from a turnover of 1.25 million down to 800,000 in a year. So we had to lay people off. We'd raced through the 70s making profit, doing well, cash flow was working all the time, was this, or let's say its small brother, which was called the Filofax. Now, I found this Filofax in a pretty grotty leather cover, not this one, in stationers in London. Thought, this is interesting, loose leaf system, could I mulberize it? So made a cover for it, did it in all our different colored leathers, and we sold it around the world, and it was just the best thing we ever did. However, the one thing I forgot to do was buy the company, because Filofax was then bought from a lovely little old lady who owned it by another gentleman, who then wrote me a letter saying, if you want to have next year's diary, you have to stop selling in America. Imagine all my customers sitting there with their Filofaxes waiting to get their next year's diary, and I couldn't give it to them, so nightmare. So we got out of that somehow. I think I had to agree not to sell to America the following year, but I knew that writing was on the wall. So we then did everything I knew was wrong with the Filofax. Paper was too thin, binder didn't work properly, size was a bit small, so I then did the Mulberry Planner, which was this one, designed that. Because we had the distribution, replaced Filofax everywhere with our own, and that's how we sashayed through that. And that item became a worldwide success with pretty much Armani team used to have it as their sort of, I suppose you could call it was the iPhone of the day at that stage. Next, we went into retail. So having realized that the recession had really crocked us and that we were now no longer in control of our lives, so to speak, and it's the same for pretty much all designers, we actually said, let's do our own shop. And we'd done concessions with Harrods and Harvey Nichols and a few in the States. So from there, we opened our own shop in St. Christopher's Place, and we opened one in Place de Victoire in Paris. And shot off through the 80s, but suddenly found cash flow. We had no money. We were going incredibly fast, but we couldn't afford to, if you like, recycle our profits fast enough because we were growing so fast. So the problem with that then meant, how do we grow our shops around Europe? So what we did was, we were approached by 2 or 3 of the best boutiques we sold to who said, could we do one of those shops you've got in Paris? So we then devised the kit. We'd already been creating a whole look, if you like, at our exhibitions. So back, you can see the stands here who've tried hard and tell you a story. You can see those that just hang it. And so we'd got our own story. We put it together and we sold it to them. And so we suddenly went from, let's say, a market in Sweden doing 100,000 to 500,000 within a year. And the brand became really well known as opposed to just, was it languishing in the back of a boutique or was it sold? So do think all the time how you bring your brand to life in a third-party retailer. We hit the next Queen's Award, end of 80s. The next recession seemed to come soon afterwards. And again, there was a big question. Fashion seemed to almost stop. So we thought we'd been creating this look in the shops, a whole design feel, style. And so I thought, let's do Mulberry Home. And that Mulberry Home collection, we launched it in Harvey Nichols, took the whole of that top floor. Richard Maynard, the MD, was a good friend, and he believed in it, and so he put the whole thing out. We had probably a space as big as all of you here for Mulberry Home. And that shot off, and of course all my franchisees saw it, loved it, did it. So we'd immediately got a business from ground zero. And when you went to the home exhibitions, you could see that all the customers and the people in that industry had come out of fashion. So I could walk around and see Mulberry handbags from years gone by. So stepping one step over was fine. Probably if I'd tried to step into engineering, that would have been a step too far. Next, as a relatively small brand, trying to break into the Vuitton, the Gucci areas, how could we really look at sponsorship and get into that wider social stream? And I'd always passionately raced historic cars throughout my career. And so we sponsored the Mulberry Historic Grand Prix Series. And we did that around Europe. And I was really trying to catch the male customer who so far had eluded us a bit. It'd been very much a female base. So we went out in Italy, Japan, and France and Germany. Historic cars were going for huge money. They were very sexy. And we raced them, which made them even sexier because they didn't, but we did. So it was something a bit British and a bit silly, but wow, they do that. So we then won lots of cups as well, and we had a great time. So think of what I said by start with. Passion, do something you enjoy doing if you possibly can while you're doing your career. How do you use stars? And we were the first to really cotton on to using celebrities. And you can probably recognize the guy in that picture. He came into our shop in St. Christopher's Place and said to my PR, I want that Donegal suit. She rang me, I was at the factory, and said, we've got Bob in the shop and he wants that Donegal suit. What shall I do? I said, well, let him buy it. And she said, no, you don't understand, he wants to be given it. So I said, well, let him have it. And he'd promised to be on the front page of the Irish Times the next day, and he was on the front page with the Prime Minister on the front page of the Irish Times. So Bob was as good as his word. Bob became a good friend. But what was amazing was Bob had been a scruff until then. We then dressed him for the next 10 years, and Bob has the most wonderful taste, looked amazing, and that story must have gone around the world and given us great PR for our menswear collection time and again. The lady underneath, does anybody recognize her? There's no volunteers. Kate Winslet. So Kate, we'd cottoned onto the fact she was doing Titanic. We knew that it was going to be big. We had her on the front of Mulberry Life 6 months before it came out. I took her to Goodwood for the hill climb there with lots of glamorous models, and Kate thinking, I've done it. Nobody had a clue who she was, and we went right through that 6 months, and nobody ever recognized her until afterwards. So timing clearly is everything. I think the use of celebrity today is way overused, but in those early days, it was a very interesting way of moving forward. 96, we went on the stock market, and Saul brings color to the market. He did. We had a fantastic send-off, but again, something about me and awards or things happening within the year, the pound had gone strong, and we went from making millions to losing millions because we were, as I said earlier, selling into Europe, free delivered, to the doorstep. We couldn't put our prices up because we were competing with the Italians, French, and our prices effectively went up by 30, but couldn't, so we lost 30% of our turnover instantly. My shops in Germany went from making 10% profit to losing 10, and you can't cut any further. So the harsh reality for an exporter is you've got to try and balance your markets, you've got to try and avoid being over-heavy in one, which we've done in America, and we were now doing in Europe again. We then had to transfer about 50% of our production overseas into Turkey, into China, places where we could make to the quality and still make money. And we didn't know when the currency was going to come back or not. So it is dangerous, but again, for me with Mulberry, without having exported, we wouldn't exist today. Opened a hotel to show the Mulberry Home Collection in 96 again, so it was a busy year, 96. And we got a Michelin star in our first year. Never really meant to own a hotel myself, but when we went on the stock market, our merchant banker said, no, you can't possibly have a hotel in the business. Roger, you've got to do it. So I had to do it myself and open the restaurant and so on, which was exciting and dangerous and not something I'd do twice. But we did get 29 6- or 8-page articles around the world in different magazines as people could come and see the Mulberry Home Collection. Got an Oscar, fashion designer or something en route. With my son Cameron, in early 2000s, designed a range of bottle-top bags which he had found as a student out in Uganda. And he came back and said, Dad, could we possibly do these as Mulberry? You could scratch on them, you'd knock somebody out with them. So I said, don't think so, son, but why don't we put old seasons leathers, all the yellows and pinks that never worked, why don't we line them with that, sell them to our retailers, go to the retailer and say, look, here's a £1,000 pack, you give us £1,000, we'll give £500 to charity, and all the money will go to charity. It was just a time when you were getting breast cancer 10% for T-shirts, and I just thought that was all wrong. And we really tried with Mulberry through the years to try and give back as far as we could to charities along the way. Cameron, I'm glad to say, is doing extremely well, and that was one of his later ones, which is a ring pull bag. They've now got a team making in Brazil and are doing very well. This was my last sort of few moments at Mulberry. This is a bag that came out of that 75 hunting, shooting, fishing collection that we did in 75, 76, and the belt wrapped round it as a double belt, which wrapped round twice. And I took a young designer, Luella Bartlett, down to the factory who was designing for us in about 2002, something like that. She was doing her own fashion show in New York. We designed this bag with her, but it had hearts and these themes on it, and we did an oversized one like this, as well as the handbag size. And we had Giselle Bundchen on the catwalk carrying this bag, and we had Chris Moore, just where our photographer is at the end, taking a photograph as she walked off the catwalk and said, I'm keeping this bag, it's mine, I want it as payment. We got that into the Evening Standard the next day, and that was the beginning of the IT bag as you know it today. Now, we could have tried so hard, so many times to achieve that. All those bits just went together that time. Moving swiftly on, in 2004, I set up Sharpen Park, which is our home. Farm came up for sale around our house. Sort of had to buy it as I came out of Mulberry. Farming my grandparents' farm, so I loved it. And there you've got spelt growing in a picture of 1870. And we found that spelt, the product that we now produce and grow and mill on the farm, had been growing in Glastonbury for 3,000 years, but we didn't find out until about 4 years after we started, which is interesting. So today we sell to Waitrose, to Whole Foods, Fortnum & Mason, a number of really good retailers, and we sell it online. And spelt really is the most amazing grain. Huge health benefits, great slow release energy, and it tastes great, which is an unusual combination. I wrote my spelt cookbook, for any of you that are interested, launched it in April this year. This was the longest collection I ever did. It took me 2 years to get the recipes together, write the book, get it published, and I hope I don't do that again either, but it's a great book. And lastly, where we've got to in our lives, Sharpen Park obviously alive and well, Mulberry alive and well. Mulberry is my tenant at Kilver Court, the sort of village that we opened up. I bought in '96 in my pension fund for Mulberry because we couldn't afford it as Mulberry. We needed a new headquarters, so I bought it. We made it Mulberry headquarters. And we had an idea to do a designer outlet village in the late Mulberry days in the late 90s, but too much else was happening. So that's it. So it's got a school, back one if you can. So it's got a schoolhouse where the Mulberry Factory Shop is. It's got cottages, a pub, amazing gardens, which were on BBC Gardeners World last year. And we've curated, if you like, a whole collection of amazing brands. So we've got about 40 brands from Mulberry, Paul Smith, Joseph, Margaret Howell, Agnes B, and then Garden Trading, Neom, Wren, whole collection, Bamford, Dalesford, And we've tried to create this together as, if you like, the ultimate shopping experience that you can eat amazingly with Sharpen Park or local food. You've got an eclectic group of not just British brands, but really interesting current brands. So I would like to describe it as a giant Corso Como that might have been, but everything is at discount. So it's an outlet village, everything is 30% off, and it's in an old textile mill, so everything is regenerated. And I think as I've gone through the last 10 years of my life, I've found I've moved from that thing of probably saying luxury to value. I really think today people are looking for an experience where they can still be challenged and excited and constantly find change, but there's a continuity through there they feel reassured by. And that's where I've got to now. So I hope I've just about got in within time. Thank you very much, everybody.